YouTube has this feature on the back end called inspiration, and you can figure out what like data black holes there are, basically. So if you search for a term, you can see the highest ranked videos and how many videos there are on the subject and stuff like that. So I was messing around with this yesterday and I searched, was Hitler an atheist? Because I wrote a book about this, was Hitler an atheist, recently, and there's like almost nothing. Makes me wonder if there's like a data black hole here, but I want to kind of go through it beginning to end and explain. Because I've talked about the subject like at length in different forms. Like I've talked about Bonhoeffer and the Catholic Church, but I want to kind of break it down. Hitler's affiliation with religion is a complicated subject, obviously. And if you read any books on this subject by anybody, like Ray Comfort or televangelists or whatever, they'll probably tell you it's complicated. But they'll most likely find a reason why they believe that he's, a pagan or an atheist or some other thing. So let me tell you the real story, no bias. And I want to go through like Jehovah's Witnesses and Catholics and everything else. Let's start with the Folkish movement. There was a guy named Houston Stewart Chamberlain that published a book titled The Foundations of the 19th Century. It was published in 1899, and it was about this superhuman group called the Aryans, and they originated in the Proto-Indo-European region, PIE. So like in India, northern India, that kind of area, and Iran, stuff, places like that. That region wrote epic stories about the Aryans, much like we have epics about, Gilgamesh. There's an epic of Gilgamesh, the Odyssey, and things like that. They wrote theirs about the Aryans. The Aryans were these super powerful, intelligent, strong people, and Houston Stewart Chamberlain became enraptured with this idea of Aryans. Loved them. His whole book was about how secretly the Aryans' enemy, the Semites, were out to trick the Aryans, to hurt them. And the only reason that Aryans were not more, like, all visually more powerful than all Semites in the world today is because the Semites, or the Jews, obviously, set out to breed with the Aryans to dilute their bloodline intentionally and specifically. Aryan and Semite include weird categories. So anybody that's black or Asian is considered Semite in Houston Stewart Chamberlain's belief system. Anybody that's white, basically, or Italian, European generally, Roman, even 2,000 years ago Roman, they all counted as Aryan. Now, as it happens, the Protestant split from Catholicism happened right there in Germany, where, Houston Stewart Chamberlain lived and wrote his seminal work and all that stuff. And Martin Luther, the guy responsible for that split, was a raging anti-Semite. Oh my God, he hated Jews. It was crazy. He wrote a document titled On the Jews and Their Lies. It's wild stuff. So anyway, religion was a massive part of the Germans' lives at the time, back in the early 1900s. Big part of their lives. 2/3 of the country was Protestant, and they were basically all Lutheran, with the exception of a couple of districts that were Reformed Church, the predecessor to Presbyterian, and a couple districts that were United Churches. So a combination of Reformed Church and Lutherans. So anyway, they were trying to get back to the roots that Martin Luther created for them, basically, the anti-Semitic roots. A lot of them were. And it was something called the Folkish movement that Houston Stewart Chamberlain didn't create, but inspired, breathed fire into. The word folk means nation or people, similar to what it means in English. But by 1899, it had taken on a mystical quality. It was no longer just people. It was now supernatural people that were given, like, rights and special roles to fill in God's whatever. Like, God supernaturally, specially ordained them to whatever. They called themselves the Folkish movement, Volkisch. And they were very much Christian, but it was kind of like, the words folk and folkish are kind of like the words race and racist. Similar, but not exactly right. So anyway, the Folkish movement takes off. And this is, remember, early 1900s. Hitler latches onto this whole thing. He believes all of this Aryan stuff from like the Proto-Indo-European region. And he believes in this Folkish movement and thinks that they really are supermen that were ordained by God and all this other stuff. It's crazy. In 1920, 21, 22, in that region, Hitler starts getting involved in the German Workers' Party, the DAP is what it was called. This is immediately after World War I ended. That was in 1919. And the German people were like really, really unhappy with the outcome of World War I. They felt like they had been cheated. They'd been lied to. And there was something called the stab in the back myth. They believed that they were so special as a result of the Folkish movement that the only way that they could have lost World War I is if they were stabbed in the back by Semites. And by the way, that term, stabbed in the back, that originates from that time period, that area. So anyway, Hitler latched onto that, joins the German Workers' Party, the DAP, and meets one of his heroes, if you will, Dietrich Eckart, who kind of inundated him with folkish ideology, early Nazi ideology, before they had the name Nazi. Around this time, 1919, 1920, a group called the Thule Society forms. And the Thule Society is like a group of what one might call pagans. It's kind of a complicated word to define and, depending on how you're using it and everything. But the way it was used at the time is anybody that believes in like Thor or Loki or Odin, or Woden is actually what it was, the Germanic gods. Anyone who believes in them would be considered pagan. Anybody that believes in like the Christian God is not pagan, but Christian. And everybody that believes in the Jewish God is Jewish, or is Aryan, basically. So the Thule Society considered themselves pagan. Sometimes they got involved in like witchcraft and stuff. Sometimes. It was not a requirement. But the Thule Society was really very small. Eventually, the Nazi Party would absorb the Thule Society seamlessly. And there were like a couple of high-ranking Thule Society members eventually, but they weren't, important. They had no, the ideology had no effect on anything. It's not as influential as people believe it is. Rudolf Hess was the highest-ranking Thule Society member, or ex-Thule Society member. Anyway, if you're familiar with the time period. In 1860, 70 years before Hitler joins the Nazi Party, or what will eventually be the Nazi Party, Darwin releases his book, The Origin of Species, 1860, in German. But before Darwin released his book, people were talking about eugenics before that, because heredity existed. They recognized the existence of heredity, the fact that, animals can inherit traits from their parents or whatever. That was already a thing. So these people, not just Germans, by the way, Americans and all kinds of other groups, set out to try to prevent bad genes from slipping into the system. But they did it in a ridiculous way that wouldn't produce any actual good results. They would claim people were feeble-minded if they didn't feel like they were like, top-tier intelligent or whatever. And they would either castrate them, otherwise sterilize them, or kill them. That was kind of the environment that Hitler walked into, one in which sterilizing people for not being as smart as somebody else was acceptable. Now, between 1920 and 1923, Hitler took control as the chairman of the Nazi Party, or the DAP, the German Workers' Party. He renamed it from the DAP to the NSDAP, which is the National Socialist German Workers' Party, is what that stood for. And it colloquially became known as the Nazi Party, of course. So anyway, 1923 rolls around, and Hitler tries to run this coup against the German government called the Beer Hall Putsch, and it almost succeeded, but it didn't. It failed. So he goes to jail. He's sentenced to 5 years, which is already not very much, since he's treasonous to the German government. But okay, 5 years. He only serves 9 months because he was a model prisoner, quote unquote. While there, he wrote his book, Mein Kampf. And Mein Kampf was like a guide to what he intended to do in the coming future. Over the next 8 years or so, from 1923 to 1933. So the next 10 years, he spent time building up an army, basically, a private paramilitary group called the Brown Shirts, the SA. He was a big fan of Mussolini's Black Shirts, who effectively, accomplished the same goal. So he kind of set up his own system with Brown Shirts based on the color of the uniform, named them the SA for short. It was an abbreviation of a German name. Anyway, they were originally his private bodyguards, but they went around and roughed people up and caused problems and all this other stuff, threatened political opponents. If people had read Mein Kampf, they would have recognized what he intended. They would have seen what he intended to do. It was psychotic. He laid out the whole roadmap in Mein Kampf. And maybe people did know. Maybe they did believe it, but they just didn't care enough to do anything about it. But in Mein Kampf, he laid a bunch of quotes down about Christianity. He very clearly was Christian, certainly in the beginning at the very least. This is from the National Socialist 25-point plan released in 1920. This is one of the points. We demand freedom for all religious denominations in the state, provided they do not threaten its existence, nor offend the moral feelings of the German race. In a speech on January 30th, 1939, Hitler said, quote, "The National Socialist state is at any time ready to undertake a clear separation of church and state, as is already the case in France, America, and other countries. The National Socialist state has not closed a church, nor has it prevented the holding of a religious service, nor has it ever exercised any influence upon the form of a religious service. But on one point there must be no uncertainty. The German priest, as servant of God, we shall protect. The priest, as political enemy of the German state, we will destroy." He's obviously lying here. He had shut down churches and caused problems for people, but the problems that he caused were all based on political foundation. So if a priest got involved in politics to any degree, he would destroy their lives. He was lying in that he said he didn't persecute Christians or whatever. He most definitely did, but it wasn't because they were Christian. He persecuted them because they were not under his control. He's laid down a bunch of other quotes. In Mein Kampf, he said some stuff. Let's see. In 1922, he gave a speech that said, quote, "My Christian feeling directs me to my Lord and Savior as a fighter. As a Christian, I do not have the duty to allow the wool to be pulled over my eyes, but I have the duty to be a fighter for the truth and for what is right. As a Christian, I also have the duty toward my own people." In Mein Kampf, he said, quote, "Hence today I believe that I'm acting in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator. By defending myself against the Jew, I'm fighting for the work of the Lord." I mean, he spoke positively about religion a lot. Most people assume that a lot of the positivity that he leveled toward Christianity was probably just a political ploy. He was most likely just trying to get people to accept him as a Christian because he recognized how powerful Christianity was in society in that moment. So anyway, he said a whole bunch of positive things about Christianity. As time rolls on, there's a new kind of denomination that starts to form, and it really starts to clearly break off in 1933 after he takes control of the government officially. There's a whole thing about that if you want to read about it, but that's, and I talk about it in my book, Was Hitler an Atheist? But we're here to talk about the religious implications of it. So anyway, he takes control in 1933, and a religious denomination starts to form called, well, they wanted to call themselves the Christian Nationalists at first, or the Protestant Nationalists, because they excluded Catholics from kind of the equation at the time. Yeah, seriously, Protestant Nationalists. I mean, does it get any more on the nose than that? Anyway, they decided to, instead of call themselves Protestant Nationalists, they went with what Hitler wanted, which was to call themselves the German Christians. And they had a really complex belief system that basically believed that Jesus was Aryan, not Jewish. That was one of the fundamental pieces of the belief system. They got around this whole thing by claiming that there was some Roman soldier named Pantera that slept with Mary, and Mary wasn't Jewish, you see. Joseph was the only Jewish person, and there was no Joseph DNA mixed up in there. So it was Pantera, an Aryan, and Mary, an Aryan, in their minds, And so they believe that Jesus was the world's first anti-Semite, basically. And he was like an Aryan fighter. Anyway, that's the basis for their belief system. It's absolutely wild. So as the German Christians are forming out their own ideology or whatever, there's another group of Christians that's forming out another ideology, or not really an ideology, but kind of fighting the German Christians, and they called themselves the Confessing Church. German Christians formed out their belief system and called it positive Christianity. So the Confessing Church is fighting positive Christianity. Positive Christianity was the Nazi form of Christianity that believed in, Jesus is an Aryan and a whole bunch of other things like that. Again, if you want a whole breakdown of the theology, it's in my book, Was Hitler an Atheist? It's on Amazon Audible. So after Hitler takes control in 1933, early 1933, the German government plans a boycott against Jewish-owned stores because they believe that Jews are like evil at heart. That's part of the Folkish belief. They're evil. Like they can't be good. It's impossible for them to be good. So they plan this boycott on April 1st, and that's when anti-Semitic legislation really starts coming through. The word Jew is scrawled across storefronts, and things were just destroyed, and people rioted and looted from Jewish stores. It was bad. Then, shortly after the April 1st boycott, the German government created what they call the Aryan paragraph. It was a line in legal code that banned Jews from being involved in government to any degree. Or not Jews, I'm sorry, I keep saying Jews, it's non-Aryans specifically. They call them non-Aryans. And that doesn't just include Jews. That's anybody who is married to somebody who is non-Aryan, or someone who has a grandparent who went to a synagogue or something when they were younger. Like, it's very, very broad. Like, not even having the blood, but just being married to somebody counts. So anyway, the Aryan paragraph banned non-Aryans from being involved in government at all. Like, they couldn't be a policeman, they couldn't be a fireman, or any of that stuff. And the German Christians adopt that into the law of the church, into the rules of the church. They're not allowed to be ministers anymore. They're not allowed to be pastors or bishops or involved in church business in any way. They hold church elections to determine who's going to control the church at the end of the day. Is it going to be one of the German Christians or one of the confessing church leaders, or one of the people in the middle called intact churches? The 28 church districts gathered together to hold church elections, and they nominated a guy named Friedrich Bodelschwing. He was loved, actually. I believe he was really, really popular. And he was a moderate. He was kind of an intact church member. He foiled the confessing church's attempts to put a stop to all of the stuff the positive Christians were doing, the German Christians were doing. So he was definitely a moderate. Well, Hitler didn't want a moderate. He wanted an extremist on his side. So he had the brown shirts harass Bodelschwing, call him at all hours of the night, and send threatening letters to his office and everything until he resigned. And now there have to be new church elections. So Hitler puts up his man, Ludwig Müller, who nobody knew. No one had any idea who this guy was. He's just some rando military chaplain. And by the way, military chaplain was not a prestigious position in the church. You're a loser if you're a military chaplain. Like, you piss somebody off somewhere along the way, that's why you're a military chaplain. So Hitler suggests this random military chaplain to go up for the church elections. And after Hitler's harassment campaign, it worked. They succeeded. They took Bodelschwing out and got Ludwig Müller, a Hitler, like a positive Christianity, a German Christian type of guy. They got him to the very top. And he started enforcing the Aryan paragraph mercilessly, basically. That's the word that the books use. He enforced it mercilessly. And from that moment forward, 15% of the church, the overarching kind of Protestant church, was German Christian. They were the nutcases. 15%. About 10% were confessing church, opposed to the German Christians. And everybody else, the other 75% or so, were just intact churches. They They agreed with the outside world on their religious doctrine, and they just kind of kept, politics and religion separate, basically. Yeah, let's say 85% of the church was not German Christian. Only 15% was. But the German Christians controlled the organization, the conference at the top. They controlled which rules were passed and everything else. There's a guy named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, really famous in this whole discussion, but he shouldn't be because he wasn't involved in any of this church struggle. It's called the Kirchenkampf. He was uninvolved. Bonhoeffer did not have anything to do with the church struggle, or certainly not with the assassination attempt on Hitler or anything. The dude is like one of the most lied about people on planet Earth, practically. It's crazy. I mean, he's a good guy. He fought Nazi oppression and all that stuff. Mad respect, but he's not some kind of, like a freedom fighter or whatever for the church. Anyway, whatever. So Bonhoeffer is watching all this unfold, and he's working with a guy named Niemöller. Niemöller is at the top of the confessing church. He's the leader. He's the one that kind of starts it. And Niemöller and Bonhoeffer worked together for a little while, but by the time the confessing church actually is formed out, I believe in 1934, Bonhoeffer is already gone. He left like last year. Niemöller is the one that's writing the documents to create the confessing church and everything. By the way, Niemöller is the same guy who famously wrote, first they came for the communists, and I said nothing because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I said nothing because I wasn't a socialist, so on and so forth. That was him. He was a Nazi, the leader of the confessing church, the opposition to Hitler's Nazified Christians. He was a Nazi too. He just believed that the state should stay out of church affairs, basically. Anyway, Bonhoeffer leaves. He had a very rich and famous father. He was a psychologist in Germany that knew senators and stuff. Like, is really, really influential. And he got Bonhoeffer out of Germany like multiple times when he should have been arrested. It was crazy how influential this dude was. He knew Sigmund Freud and stuff. Bonhoeffer's dad did. Anyway, so Bonhoeffer leaves 1933. I think October, like the 16th, 1933 or something. I don't remember. And he doesn't come back for 2 more years until 1935. By that time, Nazis had fully taken over. But Bonhoeffer returns because he feels it's cowardly to stay away. He felt he needed to face this zeitgeist or this spirit of the times with his people, with his fellow Germans. Finally, Niemöller is arrested in 1937 for the final time, and he's sent to a concentration camp where he will sit for 8 years. He will sit in there for 8 years, away from his family and everything. He's in solitary for like at least a year of it minimum. I know of at least that much. So anyway, the church struggle, the Kirchenkampf, is basically lost by this point, right? Well, Bonhoeffer joins the German intelligence agency, the Abwehr, which was a hotbed of opposition against Hitler. The admiral of the Abwehr was named, I think, Canaris, Wilhelm Canaris. Is that his name? I forget it. I'm suddenly forgetting his first name. I think it's Wilhelm. Yes, Wilhelm. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. So anyway, Canaris works with Bonhoeffer on some jobs to try to save some Jews and things like that. Eventually, they ran this plot called Operation 7 to save some close family friends of Canaris, I believe, that were Jewish, or that were non-Aryan anyway. And they succeeded, but Bonhoeffer and his brother-in-law, Donani, their role in it was uncovered because they used Abwehr funds to make it happen. And they traced the money back to Bonhoeffer and Donani. So they arrest them. And Bonhoeffer sweet talks his way out of serious repercussions. I mean, he was just really, really kind, forgiving, and just asked about the guards when he was in prison and said, even the mean ones, like when they didn't come in, are they okay? Are they doing all right? You know, they believed that he was just like an honest, nice preacher. And as a result, he never faced violence in his interrogations, not once. Bonhoeffer didn't. Donani did, but not Bonhoeffer. They were kept in separate concentration camps. So at this point, this is like 1943, I believe. The war has been raging for like a few years by now. Bonhoeffer is in prison. Niemöller is in prison. The entire structure of the confessing church is in tatters. It's destroyed. And the German Christians control basically the entirety of the Christian movement in Germany. Canaris helps a group of military agents plan an attempt on Hitler's life on July 20th, 1944. It fails. Canaris's involvement can't really be they can't figure it out exactly, but they suspect that he's up to something, so they dissolve the Abwehr and they absorb it into the SS, and they put Canaris into a concentration camp. They tortured him for names and for information he never broke, not once, never said a single name, nothing. That dude had an apple bag the size of Texas. So anyway, Canaris, he never breaks, but he's in this concentration camp just hanging out. A little bit of time passes, and they discover Canaris's diaries after a few months. And in Canaris's diaries, they find mention of Bonhoeffer and his resistance activity saving Jews, and Donani, and some other things. And Canaris was obviously revealed as a dissident and everything else, too, in his diaries. So they put them all to death on the exact same day, all three of them. They hung them from meat hooks and then burned the bodies nearly immediately, and that was the end of it. Bonhoeffer's involvement with the assassination attempt is fictitious. It never happened. The way I structured the book was I wrote I'm up to basically chapter 5. I've covered chapter 5 now. Chapter 6, 7, and 8 are on Jehovah's Witnesses, Catholics, and Denazification. So let me just break some of this down real fast. Jehovah's Witnesses, it was ultimately found they were persecuted out of principle because they had a totalitarian system that controlled their people, and Hitler didn't want that. He wanted to control the people. So he starts persecuting them. The leader of Jehovah's Witnesses at the time, Joseph Rutherford, wrote a letter to Hitler, sucking up to him, telling him he totally agreed with what he was doing to the Jews. He loved what he was up to. He loved his ideology. He was all in. He was just asking Hitler to just not persecute Jehovah's Witnesses anymore because they're loyal to him. To show how loyal they were, Rutherford scheduled a convention, a Jehovah's Witness convention in Germany, where all Jehovah's Witnesses met, and the convention center had swastikas on the outside of it, and they sang the national anthem, they sang a worship song to the tune of the national anthem at this convention. It was wild. Jehovah's Witnesses are disgusted by what just happened, horrified, and it didn't work anyway. Hitler pretty much basically ignored Rutherford entirely and continued persecuting people. So Rutherford writes another letter to Hitler, threatening him, saying, if you don't release our people from these camps, I'm going to reveal to the world what you're up to. Something he should have done anyway, seems to me, but okay. Hitler ignores. So Rutherford releases it. And it resulted in a massive telegram campaign from Jehovah's Witnesses, where they wrote, I have pictures of this on my website. Actually, let me pull it up. This is a picture of the telegram that Jehovah's Witnesses sent en masse, all over the world. Jehovah's Witnesses from the U.S., Canada, Switzerland, everywhere. Big list. Your ill treatment of Jehovah's Witnesses shocks all good people of earth and dishonors God's name. Refrain from further persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses, otherwise God will destroy you and your national party. Signed, blah. It was signed by just tons and tons of Jehovah's Witnesses from all over. That's the moment at which Hitler stood up, according to an eyewitness, and yelled, "These people will be exterminated in Germany." A wave of arrests took place, and the leader of the German Jehovah's Witnesses, Paul Balzerite, was arrested and sent to a concentration camp. Now, from this moment forward, Jehovah's Witnesses were given a choice. You can either sign this document renouncing your faith, right here, this document that I have on my screen here, or you can go back to your dormitory and suffer more. Almost invariably, they were sent back to the dorm no matter what. It didn't matter if they signed the document or not. Paul Balzerite was forced to stand in front of the camp and read a statement, forced at gunpoint, expressing Jehovah's Witnesses' support for Hitler, which, by the way, is exactly what Joseph Rutherford did in his letter to Hitler, which I also have right here. Right here, this. This is the first letter that he sent to Hitler in German. Again, it's the text is in the book. I type it all out if you want to read the book. When Paul Balzerite did that, it really pissed off Joseph Rutherford because, of course, the Nazis used it as propaganda. The leader of Jehovah's Witnesses in Germany expresses support for Hitler, of course. So Balzerite has a trial. It's a show trial. And at the trial, he says he supports Hitler and that he specifically instructed people to stop preaching when the preaching work was banned. Like, stop going door to door, knocking on people's doors and talking about Jehovah's Witnesses. When it was banned, he told people to stop. And that infuriated Joseph Rutherford, the leader of Jehovah's Witnesses, so much that he said, I'm excommunicating Paul Balzerite. And yeah, he has been sentenced to like 10 years in a concentration camp. He can sit there and rot for all I care. He said, quote, even if I had the power to get him out, I wouldn't, unquote. All because he expressed the same sentiments that Rutherford expressed earlier, privately to Hitler, and because he said that he's following the law, basically, by not preaching. Anyway, they excommunicated Balzerite, appointed a new guy as the head of Jehovah's Witnesses in Germany. Things start stepping up for Jehovah's Witnesses a lot. Their literature was banned. They were trying to get it out to a bunch, they're smuggling it all over Germany. And the main Jehovah's Witness branch was even printing their literature on little matchbook-sized things, little tiny books that are the size of matchbooks. They were smuggling them into, like, concentration camps in wooden legs and in cakes and stuff. And surprisingly, the concentration camp was where the stuff was being printed. They smuggled in a typewriter into this concentration camp. And they had the camp electrician wire up a light that would serve as like a warning. So if a guard was coming, somebody would flip a switch, the light would come on. They break down all of the printing equipment and hide it. And by the time the guard arrives, it's not there anymore. They were smuggling it in and out of the camps because Heinrich Himmler's personal astrologer and masseuse, basically, was helping. He got a Jehovah's Witness on his staff and allowed her to help the ones that were in the concentration camps distribute the magazines and stuff, the literature. The Jehovah's Witnesses were, interestingly enough, they were the first ones to release concentration camp schematics. They snuck this information out of the camps and into America, where the main Jehovah's Witness branch drew up the schematics and printed it up in a book that was released that year. I think 1937, maybe. It's crazy. So that was Jehovah's Witnesses' dealings with the Third Reich. It was all based on principle. They just didn't like them. The excuse that they used, though, was they were anti-war. They refused to enlist. They were conscientious objectors. But in the Nuremberg trials after the war, when the war criminals are being charged, they admitted they just didn't like the Jehovah's Witnesses. That's it. I wouldn't f*** with anyone willing to keister a whole printing press, right? Yeah. This joke will probably be lost, but at the end of the book, chapter 8 in Denazification, I talk about Göring, Hitler's second-in-command, how he killed himself during the Nuremberg trials. And everyone's like, where the hell did he get the cyanide capsule to kill himself? And in the book, I say he hid it in the only pocket nobody wanted to search. I don't know. I think it's funny. And it's so sad. People probably will not get to that part of the book. The good old prison wallet. Yep. They call it suitcasing. Not joking. That's what they call it in prison. Anyway, so that was Jehovah's Witnesses' role. Now let's talk about Catholics. In the early days when the Nazi Party had just taken control technically, Hitler was appointed chancellor. He didn't win his election. He was appointed to that position by another far-right politician, the president, Paul von Hindenburg. When Hitler took control in 1933, he was not considered legitimate, and the world was kind of disgusted with the things that he was saying about, being, the folk and everything. But the Pope at the time, Pope Pius XI, he decided to give Hitler legitimacy by signing a treaty with him. He asked for protection for the Catholic Church. As long as Hitler protected the church, they would support him. It was called the 1933 Reich's Concordat, signed on my birthday, weirdly, July 20th. Hitler was also there was an assassination attempt on his life on my birthday, too. That's weird, right? Weird stuff happens on my birthday. Moon landing, too. Anyway, 1933 Reich's Concordat basically said, Hitler will allow the Catholic Church to continue running their private schools, their Catholic schools. They will allow them to have their youth groups, their after-school clubs, and whatever else. And they ask for additional things, such as if somebody is wearing like Catholic clothes but are not like allowed to wear them, then they'll be charged under the same laws as like if someone is wearing a military uniform when they're not supposed to, for example. They ask for special privileges from the state. And in return, Catholic bishops and priests and everybody, they would all swear allegiance to Hitler, an oath of loyalty. And they did. They signed it. They swore the oath of loyalty in 1933, right at the outset of all of this, before he had any legitimacy. That was a massive blight on Catholic history. Now, there were two main groups at the time that were competing for biggest scumbags alive: the Nazis and the communists. They were fighting each other in the streets, blow for blow, punch for punch, shot for shot, quote unquote. That's from the literature of the time. Communism and atheism were tied at the hip, and Catholics feared that if communists took control, they would ban Catholicism. So they decided to support the Nazis instead. That's why they signed the Reich's concordat. And you know what? They were probably right. They probably would have, banned Catholics nearly immediately. So it was a gamble. There was no good situation. Democracy was over in that moment. The moment that communists and Nazis together combined took up more than 50% of the vote. It was over. So the Catholic Church supports the Nazis with the Reich's concordat of 1933. And things are going fairly smooth for the Catholic Church for a while. Northern Germany had about 40 million Protestants, and the southern part of Germany had 20 million Catholics. It's about 54% were Protestant of all of Germany. 41% were Catholic. 3.5% just believed in God, quote unquote, and then 1.5% were atheist. Those are the statistics recorded in 1939, I believe. Hitler didn't like Catholicism's hold on society, and he noticed that to the south, there were really low sign-up numbers for the Hitler Youth, which is like his after-school program, like his Boy Scouts, basically. He didn't like how low the recruiting numbers were, so he starts persecuting the Catholics to try to force them to get into line even further. But the Catholic leadership was outside of Germany. It was in Rome. Well, it was in the Vatican, of course. It was like in the Italy area, in Rome area. So he wasn't like really beholden to Hitler to the same degree that a lot of other groups were. So Hitler starts persecuting the Catholics, causing problems for them, and accusing them of immorality, quote unquote. They had morality trials where they accused them of taking advantage of little boys, basically. This era and the accusations against the church, it's largely been discarded by historians as Nazi propaganda. But as David Kurtzer says, historian on this era, he says there's a reason that the Nazis accused them of taking advantage of boys rather than like drug use or apostasy or something. It's because this was most believable because this happened, actually. They had to get like special permission, investigators did, after the war to investigate the Catholics for this later because it was so politicized during the Nazi era. So throughout 1935, I think 35 is when it really peaked. Hitler basically started arresting any Catholic priests or bishops that were oppositional to him in any way at all. Even if they weren't positive about him, he would charge them with immorality. So the Pope writes this document, Pope Pius XI still, he's about to die. In 1937, he writes this document titled With Burning Concern. And it was effectively like a repudiation of Nazi ideology. It basically said, you shouldn't hate people based on their race. All people can come to Jesus through blah, 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 whatever. And he had it printed up secretly and delivered to every single parish by boys on bicycles. And it was read on the same Sunday, all at the same time. And it took the Nazis by surprise. They're like, holy shit, I did not see that one coming. Hitler had brown shirts go into like Catholic parishes or whatever and confiscate all copies of With Burning Concern, arrest anybody in possession of them, and force any printing offices that printed it to shut down in Germany. He was mad. This is 1937. Now, after With Burning Concern, things continued to heat up, and there were more morality trials, and it just got way, way uglier until Pope Pius XI. He'd been pope since, like, forever, since before any of this started. In 1939, he plans to give a speech that will, quote-unquote, long be remembered. It was basically what he intended to be his dying act. He was going to destroy Nazism emotionally and otherwise. It was called the Hidden Encyclical because the day before he was to deliver it, he died. And Mussolini contacts the Vatican, who then contacts Pacelli, who was his second in command. Pacelli is Pope Pius XI's Secretary of State at that moment. He asked Pacelli to destroy it. And Pacelli says, "You got it." He said he ordered the Vatican printing press to destroy it, and they said not one comma of the speech will remain. But somebody preserved a copy because I think in 2008, they released a trove of archives from the Vatican, and we got our mitts on a copy of the Hidden Encyclical. It was a pretty soft denunciation of Nazism. They just basically quoted some Bible verses that said Nazism is religiously incorrect. Like it's a heretical position to believe that Jews cannot join Christianity. So anyway, the Pope dies the day before he's supposed to deliver this encyclical. There were conspiracy theories all over this thing, but historians unanimously pretty much conclude that it was just, he was old. He knew that he was on his last leg. He was asked by his doctors, the Pope was, to move the speech up until he was stronger. And the Pope knew that he wasn't going to get stronger, and he refused. After Pope Pius XI dies, his Secretary of State, Pacelli, is elected to be the new Pope, and he takes the name Pope Pius XII. That was in 1939. February 11th, 1939, the Pope was scheduled to give the encyclical, dies on February 10th, and within a very short time frame, I think within weeks or months, Pacelli takes control. After Pacelli takes control, there were secret meetings between him and a representative of the Hitler government. Prince Philip von Hessen, I believe is his name, meets with the Pope in an apartment building, in a complex, so that nobody knew they were meeting. Even the ambassador to Germany for the Vatican didn't know this was happening. And in the conversation, they basically, in a veiled way, said, "Stop the morality trials, stop accusing my priests of all this stuff, and we will be the most loyal demographic of people in Germany. We'll be fully loyal to Hitler if you stop charging us with this." It's probably worth it to note that shortly before this, the Pope had all files on child abuse burned so that it couldn't be retrieved by the Nazis or anything. So, I don't know, take that for what you will. But shortly after all of that happened, within like a year or two, Mussolini was deposed. He was voted out by his Grand Council, and he was imprisoned. At which point, of course, Mussolini was like a big ally of Hitler. So Hitler invades Italy, takes ownership of it. He sends a commando unit to free Mussolini and puts him in control of some puppet nation up north or whatever, some puppet region. And so Hitler is occupying Italy and the whole Rome area. They're planning to deport all of the Jews from the region because Mussolini didn't see the need to solve the Jewish question, quote unquote, or the immigrant problem, if you will. He didn't see the need to solve that problem in Italy at the time, so he just left him be. When Hitler invaded, he told his general in the area, Kepler, I think was his name. Let me find, what was the name? Oh, it was close. Herbert Kappler, SS Major Herbert Kappler. He was in control of the deportation, the region. He told the Jews in the area, if you give me $4.2 million worth of gold, I won't deport you. They didn't have $4.2 million worth of gold. 50 kilos is what he asked for. So it's $4.2 million in today's money. Some showed up with some gold. It wasn't enough. They He said basically they had like 36 hours to get it. So they ask the Vatican, they're asking everybody they can to help them get this gold, save 40,000 lives. The Vatican basically agrees to loan them the gold. They said, obviously, we want it back, but there's no time limit on repayment, and there's no interest on it either. But it didn't matter because the Christian community in the region contributed their rings and their everything that they had to gather up the gold they needed. And they got enough on time. They brought it there, and they weighed it twice because the Nazis didn't trust the Jews to count it correctly. They delivered it there. The boxes of gold were shipped to Berlin, where they sat on a storeroom floor until the end of the war, were never used. Hitler ordered them deported anyway a month later. The Vatican claims to have loaned the Jewish community a bunch of gold to save them. That's not true either. That's a lie. They agreed to, but they didn't put up a single dime. The claim going around was that the Vatican melted down precious artifacts to save them. That did not happen. And it eventually gets to the point where Hitler talked about kidnapping the Pope. He wrote up a plan. He asked a guy named Wolf. He was one of the generals. He asked him to write up a plan to kidnap the Pope. By the time this happened, this is actually Pope Pius XII. And Wolf was a loyal, faithful Catholic. Oops, wrong guy to ask about that, I suppose. Anyway, Wolf kind of deters Hitler. He says, okay, well, it's going to take me forever. And Hitler says, how long? And he says, oh, like 2 months. And he's like, well, I want it now. That's what Hitler said. And he said, well, I'm sorry, man. If you want it now, I'm going to have to pull some of the military off of the front lines to come to Italy with me to do this, because they're not going to like this. And Hitler was like, all right, fine. Update me in every 2 weeks. Just give me an update every 2 weeks, so let me know where you are with this plan. I'm not joking. That's how the conversation went. So 2 weeks later, Hitler contacts Wolf and he says, how's it going? You got the plan? Wolf says, still working on it. And Hitler says, all right. Comes back 2 weeks later. Says, where is it? What's going on with this? And Wolf says, look, this is a bad idea. If for no other reason than because the Italian people really like the Pope. It's a heavily Catholic area, and, Italy's goodwill toward us is already kind of strained. We're going to have to pull a lot of troops off to basically occupy Italy if you do this. Wolf calls the popes, well, he calls the Vatican, and he informs the Pope that Hitler intended to do this. And he says, you don't need to worry, I will keep the Pope safe. Then he talks Hitler out of doing it. I mean, that should show the power of the Catholic Church, right? That the general assigned to kidnap the Pope informed him to keep him safe. The Catholics had a lot more power than they wielded in this situation. If the Pope decided that he didn't want to support the Nazi regime anymore, he didn't have to. He could have done it like that and ordered Catholics to stop supporting Nazis, stop voting for them. The bottom half of Germany would have split off if he had said that. No longer been in control. It would have had to have been occupied. Half of the army would have left, would have mutinied. So the point is that the Pope had a lot of power and he used none of it. None of it. Effectively. Almost none of it. There were a lot of examples of nuns and monks and individual pastors and things helping the Jews, hiding them. There were some examples of Catholic priests opening the catacombs in their churches to hide the Jews, let them hide, and in the mausoleums and stuff, basically. A lot of examples of that. And in fact, I believe, I don't know this for a fact, so don't quote me, I think that Pacelli, Pius XII, allowed Jews to hide in his summer home. Castel Gandolfo is what it was called. But then there are a lot of stories of people like Father Kuhn, a Catholic priest, who followed around a battalion of Nazis, and when aiming their guns at Jewish victims, yelled, "In the name of Christ, fire." Catholicism was a mixed bag, and it didn't have to be. The Pope had so much control over the people of Catholicism, the Catholics, had so much control over them. He could excommunicate, he could promote, He could ban people from doing certain things. He could ban them from being involved in the SS or in the Wehrmacht or the Luftwaffe or whatever. But he chose to remain silent. He chose to quietly, carefully hide how many Jews in Castel Gandolf? Like 10? How many could he fit in a summer home? I don't know. Hell, maybe it's 100. But he could have instructed his priests to fight against the Nazis any way they could. And he could have excommunicated any priests that didn't. He chose not to. So take that for what you will. I have little to no respect for Pope Pius XII, for Pacelli, what he did in that time. I think he was a scumbag personally, but that's just me. You can make up your own moral choice about what Pacelli did, if he was right or wrong or whatever. But that's basically how Catholics did it. After the war, the Vatican was the center of something called a Ratline. It was like a network where people provided false papers for Nazi war criminals that were trying to escape to Argentina or Spain or Mexico or whatever. Mostly South America. To my knowledge, I believe that Pacelli was unaware and uninvolved of any of these like Ratlines. There was talk of an organization called Odessa that supposedly ran like these Ratlines in the Catholic Church, but as far as anyone can tell, Odessa wasn't real. There was no Odessa organization. It was just a few people in the Vatican that were like organizing this effort to save the Nazis, effectively. Now, regarding denazification, this is my 8th chapter. We've finished chapter 7 on Catholicism. After the war, the Allies controlled the region completely. They ran the government. They ran everything. And their denazification tactics were interesting. One of the main tactics used, not just for like church denazification, but for general denazification, were something called Perseelschein letters. Perseelschein. So Persil was like their laundry detergent that they used. And these Perseelschein letters were used to exonerate somebody. So they were holding war crime charges, basically war crime courts. It's called the Spruchhammer Court, where they were charging people with war crimes. And if you could get your hands on a Perseelschein letter from one of the victims of Nazi oppression, then you could be exonerated. So people that were in concentration camps, they got letters from the guards that like beat them every day. The guard asking if you would be willing to write a Perseelschein letter for me. And some of them are gold, like some of the responses. One guy basically said, "You want a Perseelschein letter from me? Like, yeah, you didn't do anything to me. But do you really think that makes you qualified to help rebuild the country of Germany now? Just because you didn't hurt me? You didn't help me either." It was good. Some of them are really on point. The church denazification effort was led by Martin Niemöller, dude who started the Confessing Church, and the guy who said, first they came for the communists, but I didn't say anything because I wasn't a communist, and the socialists, that guy. He was a Nazi. He was a full-blown believing Nazi, voted for the Nazis in 1924, 28, and 33. But he helped in the denazification efforts because I think he kind of, for the most part, largely became de-brainwashed from the Nazi beliefs. But while he was working on denazifying the church, he gave us such quotes as, what was it? Hold on, let me find it. Here. Okay, here's the quote right here. Quote, "The crucial issue was not whether the USA or the USSR would win the next war. The big question, rather, was whether there would still be a white race in 30 or 40 years. Oh, I think that was me I put that quote in Wikipedia. That's funny. I rewrote parts of Niemöller's biography on Wikipedia, and that was me that wrote that. Anyway, he was a racist. He was a terrible person, and I have basically no sympathy for him. And after the war, he did lead the effort to denazify by pushing through the Stuttgart Declaration, but the Cold War soon followed after World War II because, the Soviet Union, the USSR, They were like the new enemies, basically, of the West after Germany. And Niemöller sided with the USSR. He got a bunch of like pro-Soviet awards and stuff like that. So take that for what you will. He was just a racist. He just wasn't a good person. This is a picture of him, if you're curious, from 1917, World War I. He was the commander of a U-boat. So the Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt, that was one of the main ways in which the church denazified. They used Pasilschein letters, of course. And the Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt basically said, this is just part of it. With great pain we say, through us infinite wrong was brought over many peoples and countries, that which we often testified to in our communities. We express now the name of the whole church. We did fight for long years in the name of Jesus Christ against a mentality that found its awful expression in the National Socialist regime of violence, but we accuse ourselves for not standing to our beliefs more courageously, for not praying more faithfully, for not believing more joyously. Anyway, you get the idea. It was a Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt. It was super controversial. Nobody wanted to sign it, but Niemöller, as basically the head of the church at this point, since he was leading denazification efforts, he signed it on behalf of the churches anyway. The Allies, when they came in to denazify the church, they drew up lists basically of known Nazi collaborators, and about 15% of the clergy were on those lists. So 15% of the church, give or take, were Nazis. They cleared them all out. And actually clearing out the Nazis was very controversial within the church. People were pissed when they started removing the Nazis because they respected the hell out of them. And unfortunately, the people at the top of industry, like of the people that organized food distribution and things in Germany, they were Nazis too, but they couldn't be removed because nobody else knew how to do that job. The Allies didn't want to be responsible for feeding the German people, so they left the Nazis in place. A lot of Nazis got away with it, and a lot of people consider the denazification efforts to be a massive failure. In my opinion, I don't think that denazification was a massive failure solely because it caused a degree of embarrassment. Like, people were embarrassed to admit that they were Nazis, and that made it so that people just didn't come out and talk about it at all. And when people weren't talking about it, nobody heard about it, and it just kind of died as an ideology. Denazification failed in de-brainwashing people, but it succeeded in not brainwashing a new generation, basically. That's my analysis of it. And I don't believe there's anything that could have been done in retrospect to de-brainwash the existing Nazis. They brought them to like big movie theaters where they played film footage recorded by Nazis of concentration camps, of guards using big equipment to shovel dead bodies into, mass graves and things. They forced people to tour the concentration camps, showed them like Dr. Mengele's, office and all the crazy messed up shit that he did there. They did all that they could. The Allies did. There was nothing else that they could have done to denazify, in my opinion. They also burned books. The Allies, they burned any books that were positive about Nazism. They banned swastikas and Nazi paraphernalia. They banned people from talking about Nazi ideology. They banned them from preaching positive Christianity. They banned German Christian churches, basically, too. So they banned a whole bunch of this stuff, and that was the denazification effort. What else do you do? I don't know that there's anything else that you can do. And it didn't work, really, because there were still Nazis at the end of the day. At least it prevented the next generation from being brainwashed. There's that. So anyway, that's the story of Hitler's involvement with Christianity. That is basically a summary of my book. I give a bunch of quotes in it and a lot more detail about all kinds of other things. Really fascinating stuff, and I hope you guys give it a read. Was Hitler an Atheist? Amazon and Audible. It's on my website, too, owenmorgan.com. You can check out the pictures without buying the book, or check out my sources on there, too. But anyway, yeah, let me know what you think about it in the comments. I have spent a year of my life researching this, so hopefully you find it as interesting as I do.